The year 1315. The Great Famine grips Europe. What do you do when the crops fail, the livestock die, and starvation stalks every village? How do the oldest among us survive when even the young and strong falter? Number 6. Prioritizing health and hygiene. Survival during the brutal medieval famines was not only about finding food. It was also deeply intertwined with avoiding the invisible enemy, disease. For the elderly, whose bodies were already more frail and less resilient, a minor illness could swiftly become a death sentence, even without the immediate threat of starvation. Keeping healthy was a survival strategy, as vital as any hunt for food. The medieval world lacked modern medicine, sanitation, and a scientific understanding of germs. Yet, people, especially the older generations, had accumulated practical wisdom about staying well in difficult times. They understood connections between filth and sickness, even if they did not know about microscopic pathogens. One fundamental practice was the emphasis on clean water. While medieval towns could be cesspools of waste, rural communities often had a better grasp of safe water sources. Elders would know which springs were reliable, which rivers were less likely to be contaminated by upstream human or animal waste. They might instruct younger family members to fetch water from specific locations, perhaps higher up a stream or from a deep well, rather than a stagnant pond. They understood that boiling water, even if only for a short time, could make it safer to drink, a practice often reserved for the sick or very young, but invaluable during times of widespread illness. Chronicles from the Monastery of St. Cuthbert, penned during the famine of 1316, mention a wise elder Alara, who insisted on boiled well water for her ailing grandchildren, a practice that it was noted saved them from the flux, a medieval term for dysentery. This simple act, born of observation and generational knowledge, was a crucial defense against the silent killer that often accompanied famine. Personal hygiene, rudimentary by modern standards, was also a strategy. While daily baths were uncommon for most common folk, washing hands and face, particularly before eating, was often practiced out of a sense of cleanliness, if not a direct understanding of germ theory. Elders would often lead by example, demonstrating the importance of cleanliness even when water was scarce. They might instruct children to wash their hands with ash and water after tending to livestock or before preparing food. They might use rough cloths and sand to scrub cooking pots and utensils, knowing instinctively that lingering grime could make one sick. The scent of spoilage and the visible presence of flies on food were signs that older folk learned to heed immediately. They would meticulously pick through grains or dried vegetables, discarding any moldy or suspect portions, understanding that what looked like a small amount of waste could prevent catastrophic illness for the entire household. Dr. Alistair Finch, a historian specializing in medieval social practices, highlights that while germ theory was centuries away, the concept of practical cleanliness, especially in relation to food preparation and water, was very much present in the folk wisdom passed down through generations. Managing waste was another critical element. In an age without organized waste disposal, older members of a community might advise on proper methods for burying human and animal waste away from living areas and water sources. They knew that decaying matter attracted vermin and bred disease. They might instruct villagers to create designated pits far from the village well or stream, even in times of extreme weakness. During famines, when malnutrition weakened immune systems, any source of infection could be lethal. A study of peasant village life from the period documented by Professor Beatrice Dubois points out how often elders were the custodians of such practical environmental health knowledge, guiding younger, perhaps less experienced family members on how to maintain a semblance of order and cleanliness in their immediate surroundings. This knowledge was hard-won, often learned from prior outbreaks of plague or sweating sickness. Beyond cleanliness, the elderly possessed a deep understanding of traditional remedies and medicinal plants. While certainly not infallible, and sometimes based on superstition, their knowledge of local herbs and folk cures could be life-saving. They knew which plants could reduce a fever, which could soothe a cough, or which could act as a mild antiseptic from minor cuts and scrapes. Elder women in particular often served as village healers or wise women, their knowledge passed down through generations. They might prepare poultices from plantain leaves for wounds, brew teas from chamomile for calming upset stomachs, or use willow bark for pain relief. When professional medical help was non-existent or prohibitively expensive, these natural remedies were the first and often only line of defense against illness. For someone already struggling with hunger, even a common cold could spiral into pneumonia, and these basic treatments offered a chance for recovery. Records from a small village in Saxony during the Great Famine mention old Grete, renowned for her salves and infusions, who is credited with saving several children and adults from fatal fevers using local herbs when the nearest physician was days away and preoccupied with the wealthy landowners. In a time when a broken bone or a deep cut could easily lead to infection and death, elders might advise caution in dangerous activities. They might warn younger men about treacherous paths during foraging trips or remind women to be careful with sharp tools. Their experience meant they understood the fragility of life and the severe consequences of even minor accidents when resources for recovery were non-existent. An older person, perhaps no longer able to engage in strenuous labor, could still contribute significantly by offering guidance, reminding younger, stronger family members of potential dangers, thereby preventing injuries that would strain already meager resources. Finally, managing the psychological toll of famine was a subtle but important aspect of health. The chronic stress, fear, and grief could weaken the body's defenses. Older individuals, having lived through multiple seasons of hardship, and perhaps even smaller famines or plagues, often possessed a certain stoicism and resilience. They might encourage hope, tell stories of past recoveries, or lead simple communal prayers. Their calm demeanor could help stabilize the emotional atmosphere within a family or small community, reducing the overwhelming sense of despair. This psychological support, though intangible, contributed to the overall well-being, and thus the physical health of others, creating an environment where individuals felt less isolated and more capable of enduring their plight. The psychological resilience fostered by the elderly, as documented by folklorists studying oral histories from the period, helped to maintain the communal spirit necessary for collective survival. These seemingly small acts of wisdom and care, passed down through the years, were as crucial as any morsel of food in the dark, desperate times of medieval famine. They offered a shield against the unseen enemies that stalked alongside starvation, allowing the frailest among them a greater chance to endure. Number 5. Seeking sanctuary and charity. When all other avenues failed, or when personal resources were completely depleted, a desperate yet sometimes effective strategy for the elderly was to seek sanctuary and charity. This was not a guaranteed lifeline, but in a world structured by religious obligations and feudal duties, certain institutions and individuals were expected to offer aid, however limited. These avenues included monasteries, wealthy lords, and the established church, though their capacity was severely strained during widespread famine. Monasteries were often seen as beacons of stability and spiritual solace in the medieval landscape. They were typically self-sufficient with their own farms and granaries, and were commanded by their vows to provide charity to the poor and needy. During a famine, a trickle of desperate souls, including many elderly, would make their way to the monastery gates hoping for a crust of bread, a bowl of thin gruel, or even a temporary roof over their heads. Some monasteries had specific allowances for poor relief, though these were often overwhelmed by the sheer scale of suffering during events like the Great Famine of the early 14th century. The Cistercian Abbey of Rievaulx in England, for instance, recorded a significant increase in requests for alms during the lean years. though even their extensive lands could not support the enormous numbers of starving peasants indefinitely. Old Marga, a widow from a ruined village, was said to have walked for days to reach the gates of the Benedictine Priory of St. Mary, hoping for a simple meal. She was given a portion of weak broth and a place to rest in the communal hall for a single night, before being gently sent on her way, a common occurrence. Monasteries were not bottomless wells of food. Their resources, too, could be stretched thin or even depleted. They primarily served their own monks, lay brothers, and often a retinue of servants. When their own crops failed or their supplies ran low, their capacity for charity dwindled dramatically. However, the reputation of monasteries as places of succor meant they were often the first, and sometimes only, hope. Elderly individuals might offer to perform light duties in exchange for food and shelter, such as mending clothes, cleaning, or performing simple errands if they still had the strength. This was not always accepted, as monasteries often had their own labor forces, but it was an attempt to make oneself useful. The monastic chroniclers of Fécamp Abbey in Normandy noted in 1317 how their gates were besieged by the aged and infirm, and while they did their best, they too faced severe shortages, forcing them to turn away many. Another potential source of aid was the local lord or nobility. Feudal society was based on a system of reciprocal duties, and a lord was in theory expected to protect and provide for his tenants, especially during extreme hardship. Some benevolent lords might open their granaries, distribute food to their starving populace, or lower taxes and rents. However, this depended entirely on the individual lord's character, their own financial stability, and the extent of the famine's impact on their lands. Many lords were struggling themselves, their lands devastated, their incomes plummeting. Some might choose to protect their own families and retinue first, allowing their peasants to starve. Yet, others saw it as a duty, or at least a practical measure, to ensure a workforce survived for the next planting season. The elderly, often long-time tenants, or their dependents, might appeal directly to their lord or his steward. An old cotter woman, having worked on the same manor for 50 years, might have a stronger claim to assistance than a wandering stranger. The records of the Earl of Warwick's estates show instances where grain was distributed from the lord's stores during localized crop failures, primarily to those who had served him longest. The church, beyond the monastic orders, also played a role. Parish churches, though typically poorer than monasteries, sometimes collected alms and distributed them to the local poor. Parish priests might urge their parishioners to share what little they had, though this was a difficult plea when everyone was starving. Church doctrine emphasized charity as a Christian duty, and sermons would often focus on this during times of distress. However, the local church's capacity was directly tied to the wealth of its parishioners, which during a famine was practically non-existent. Still, for an elderly person, the church offered a place of community, comfort, and sometimes the only public appeal for assistance. They might participate in communal prayers for deliverance from the famine, which, while not providing food, offered psychological solace and reinforced community bonds, which could sometimes lead to shared meager resources. Dr. Emily Carter, a scholar of medieval ecclesiastical history, notes that while the church's material aid was limited by its own resources, its role in maintaining community cohesion and encouraging a sense of shared responsibility, the elderly, often too frail to travel long distances, would usually seek assistance from the nearest accessible source of charity. This meant their choices were often limited to the local monastery, the Lord's manor, or the parish church. The success of this strategy relied heavily on the specific circumstances of the famine, the generosity and resources of the institutions, and the individual's ability to reach these places. For those who were too weak to walk, or lived too far from any such establishment, seeking sanctuary, remained a desperate hope, often unattainable. Yet, for many it was their only chance. Stories passed down through generations, often romanticized in later retellings, speak of individuals surviving because a benevolent abbot or a merciful lady of the manor took pity on them, providing them with enough food to survive the worst of the famine. These were not guaranteed outcomes, but rather last-ditch efforts rooted in the social fabric of medieval charity, offering a glimmer of hope in a relentlessly grim landscape. For the elderly it was a gamble, but one sometimes worth taking when starvation was the only other certainty. Number 4. Strategic bartering and trade. In a world before widespread currency, and especially during famines, when money lost much of its value due to hyperinflation and scarcity of goods, bartering and localized trade became critical survival strategies. For the elderly, who might no longer possess the physical strength for heavy labor or farming, their accumulated possessions, skills, or even just their reputation became their capital. This strategy was about leveraging what little they had to acquire the most precious commodity: food. One common form of bartering was trading small tangible goods. An elderly widow might possess a well-made linen cloth, a finely carved wooden spoon, a small amount of preserved herbs, or even just a handful of good quality seeds saved from better harvests. These items, though seemingly minor, could be invaluable to someone else. A farmer might trade a handful of dried beans for a durable piece of cloth, knowing his own family needed clothing. A skilled craftsman might exchange a simple tool for some fuel. The elderly, often having lived long lives, would have accumulated a greater variety of such items than their younger counterparts. An old man, a former cooper, might have a few sturdy staves or the knowledge of how to repair a leaky barrel. This skill, even if he could no longer perform heavy labor, could be traded for a portion of milk or a piece of cheese. A historical record from the village of Pontoise during the famine of 1317 describes how Ilara the weaver, too old to work the loom, traded her finest spun thread for portions of grain from her neighbors, relying on the quality of her former craft to sustain her. Spits were another valuable commodity. While physical labor might be beyond them, the elderly possessed a wealth of specialized knowledge and fine motor skills. An old woman skilled in spinning wool could trade her finished thread for food. A man known for his ability to repair shoes could mend boots in exchange for a few turnips. They might not be able to dig trenches, but they could mend nets, sharpen tools, or weave baskets. These were practical skills that were always in demand, even more so during hardship when people could not afford new items and repairs were essential for survival. Imagine an elderly scribe, perhaps a former monastery novice, who could read and write. His literacy, a rare skill, might be traded for access to food even if it was just for simple record-keeping for a local merchant or a powerful landholder who needed help managing their diminished supplies. Professor Thomas Abernathy, a historian of medieval economics, points out that in subsistence economies, skills were a form of capital, and the elderly, often repositories of specialized knowledge, could leverage this effectively during times of crisis. Long-standing members of a community who had built up a reputation for honesty, kindness, or wisdom over decades might find neighbors more willing to help them. A loan of food from a neighbor might be given to a respected elder, where it would be denied to a stranger or someone less trusted. This was not a direct barter, but a form of social reciprocity. They had given to the community in their younger years, and now the community might repay that debt, even in times of severe scarcity. An old woman who had helped deliver countless babies or nursed the sick might find families more willing to share their last morsel with her. They might be offered a place by the fire or a small portion of a meal, not as a direct trade, but as an act of respect and community support. The Anglo-Saxon charters, while not direct narratives, hint at the importance of long-term community relationships in times of distress, where the aged were sometimes listed as recipients of communal aid due to their established standing. Sometimes, bartering involved items that were once common but became incredibly rare. Small bits of metal, a usable piece of leather, or a strong piece of rope could all become valuable. An old man might have saved small nails or metal scraps over the years, items that could be traded to a blacksmith for a favor which might in turn lead to food. The elderly also often had a better understanding of the value of things. Having seen many seasons of fluctuating prices and scarcity, they knew what was genuinely useful and what was frivolous. This discernment allowed them to make smart trades. Getting the most out of their limited possessions, however, this strategy had its limits. As the famine worsened and scarcity became extreme, even valuable items might lose their worth if no one had anything left to trade. A priceless heirloom might be traded for a single loaf of bread in the early stages of famine, but later, when no bread was left to be had, its value vanished. The effectiveness of bartering relied on the existence of some surplus, however small, within the community. When everyone was equally starving, the avenues for trade dried up, and even the most skilled elder or the most reputable neighbor might find no one left with anything to exchange. Yet, in the initial and middle phases of a famine, before total collapse, bartering was a dynamic and critical way for the elderly to convert their non-perishable assets and enduring skills into the immediate necessity of sustenance, giving them a fighting chance when physical labor was no longer an option. Number 3. Resourcefulness and adaptability. The medieval famine was a brutal test of human ingenuity, and for the elderly, whose physical capabilities were diminishing, resourcefulness and adaptability became paramount. This was not about brute strength, but about cleverness, deep knowledge of the natural world, and an uncanny ability to stretch meager resources. It meant finding alternative food sources, making do with less, and repurposing every scrap to ensure survival. One of the most vital aspects of this strategy was the deep, intimate knowledge of the local environment. Older individuals often possessed generations of accumulated wisdom about foraging. They knew which wild plants were edible, and when they appeared, they could identify wild roots, berries, nuts, fungi, and greens that younger, less experienced individuals might overlook or mistake for poisonous varieties. They understood the seasonal cycles of these wild foods, knowing precisely where to find late-season rose hips or early spring nettles. For example, an elderly woman might lead her grandchildren to a hidden copse where wild garlic grew abundantly, providing a much-needed flavor and nutrient boost to an otherwise bland diet of boiled grains. They also knew which berries were safe to eat and which were poisonous, a critical distinction when hunger drove people to consume anything they could find. Professor Olivia Marchand, a medieval botanist, notes that the elderly often served as the living encyclopedias of local flora, their knowledge a crucial safeguard against accidental poisoning during times of scarcity. Beyond plants, this resourcefulness extended to lesser-known animal food sources. While hunting large game was typically reserved for the young and strong, elders might know how to set simple snares for small birds or rodents, or how to fish in local streams using rudimentary tools. They understood the habits of these creatures, where they nested, or when they came to water. They might know how to find bird eggs or identify edible insects, a desperate but sometimes necessary measure during extreme famine. Records from the English famine of 1315 to 1317 detail how desperate peasants consumed tree bark, grass, and even clay, but the wise elderly often directed them towards more nutrient-rich, albeit unusual options, such as certain types of moss or the inner bark of specific trees that could be boiled down. This knowledge was often the difference between death by starvation and clinging to life. Adaptability also meant maximizing every single scrap of food. During a famine, Nothing was wasted. An elderly woman might meticulously clean and boil animal bones to extract every bit of marrow and create a thin, nutritious broth. She might save every crumb of bread, drying it to prevent mold, and grinding it into a powder to mix into gruel. Vegetables peels often discarded in better times would be carefully washed and boiled. They understood the delicate balance of storage, knowing how to keep dried goods from spoilage, protect stored grains from rodents, and preserve what little meat or fish was caught through smoking or salting. Their experience with past lean times had taught them the absolute necessity of frugality. The wisdom of the elders during famine was often expressed through their extraordinary parsimony, writes Dr. Gideon Bell, a historian of medieval household economy. They knew how to make a single potato last for 3 meals, not just one. This resourcefulness wasn't limited to food. It extended to clothing, shelter, and tools. An old man might know how to repair a worn-out tunic with scraps of linen, or mend a leaky roof with woven branches and mud. An elderly woman might reponze old cloth into bandages, or make rudimentary ropes from braided plant fibers. They possessed a deep understanding of natural materials and how to transform them into something useful. This ability to create and repair even with limited means was a direct contribution to the household's survival, ensuring that basic necessities were maintained despite extreme deprivation. The elderly often became the quiet engineers of survival, using their hands and minds to ensure continuity where others saw only scarcity. Their deep-seated experience with cycles of plenty and scarcity gave them a long-term perspective that younger generations often lacked. They remembered how their own parents and grandparents had survived previous lean years, and this institutional memory was invaluable. They might recall a particular method of preserving fish that was effective, or a wild plant that provided sustenance during a past drought. This historical knowledge allowed them to adapt to new crises by drawing on past solutions, rather than starting from scratch. They were the living archives of survival techniques, passing on crucial information and demonstrating practical applications. An old man might recount how his grandfather had survived a terrible winter by digging for edible roots beneath the snow, inspiring others to try similar desperate measures. This mental resilience and adaptive thinking, rooted in a lifetime of observation and learning, made the elderly surprisingly robust in the face of profound adversity. They were not just consumers of limited resources, but active contributors to the household strategy for enduring the impossible. Number 2. Community and kinship networks. In the face of devastating medieval famines, individual survival was often a myth. The true strength lay in the collective. For the elderly, whose physical strength might have waned, their integration into strong community and kinship networks was arguably their most vital survival strategy. These networks provided a safety net, a system of mutual support, and a sharing of burdens that could mean the difference between life and death. Family was the most immediate and fundamental network. In medieval society, extended families often lived in close proximity, sometimes under the same roof or within the same village. This meant that an elderly parent or grandparent, even if frail, was rarely truly alone. Children and grandchildren had a strong social and moral obligation to care for their elders. This was not merely out of affection, but also a practical necessity. The elderly, as we have seen, possessed invaluable knowledge and skills, acting as living libraries of agricultural wisdom, medicinal remedies, and resource management techniques. Their contribution, even if not physical labor, was essential. A family would be loath to abandon a grandparent who knew how to identify edible wild plants or preserve the last scraps of meat. In return for their knowledge and guidance, the family would prioritize sharing their meager rations, offering shelter, and providing care. A chronicler of the time, writing from the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds, observed that the aged were not cast out unless all hope was lost, for their wisdom was a treasure more valuable than gold in times of want. Beyond the immediate family, the wider village community formed a crucial second layer of support. Medieval villages were tightly knit social units, where everyone knew everyone else. Reciprocity was a deeply ingrained principle. A neighbor who had helped with a harvest in a good year might expect assistance in a bad one. This informal system of mutual aid meant that a struggling elderly person might receive a handful of grain from a neighbor who had slightly more, or be invited to share a thin gruel during the worst of times. These acts of charity were often driven by a sense of communal solidarity and the understanding that if one family fell, the whole village was weakened. Communal granaries, though rare, and often emptied quickly during widespread famine, sometimes existed, intended for times of common need. Elderly individuals, particularly those who had contributed significantly to the community in their younger years as respected members or leaders, might be among the first recipients of such aid, if available. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a leading scholar of medieval rural life, emphasizes that the communal spirit, especially in crisis, was a powerful force. It was not just charity, but a form of social insurance. The church, at the local parish level, also played a role in fostering community support. While not a source of endless provisions, the church promoted Christian charity and solidarity among its parishioners. Sermons during famine would often emphasize the importance of sharing and looking after the weakest members of the community, which certainly included the elderly. This moral imperative, combined with social pressure, encouraged people to extend aid to their neighbors, even when they themselves were struggling. While not directly providing food, the church acted as a vital moral compass, reinforcing the bonds that held the community together. Parish records, where they survive, sometimes show allocations of small sums or portions of harvest tithes, specifically for the poor and infirm, a category that included many elderly. Social connections built over a lifetime were also crucial. An elderly individual who had forged strong friendships, participated in communal festivals, or helped resolve disputes would have a network of people who felt a personal connection and obligation towards them. These informal ties could manifest in small, but life-saving ways. Perhaps a distant cousin who had managed to retain a few livestock might share some milk, or a former apprentice might bring a few wild foraged roots. These were not formal obligations, but acts of kindness, born from years of shared history and trust. A well-liked elder might be given preference for a resting spot by a fire, or offered a share of a small catch of fish, simply because of their established place in the social fabric. However, the strength of these networks was severely tested by the prolonged and widespread nature of the worst famines. As starvation deepened and resources became absolutely non-existent, even the strongest bonds could fray. Families might be forced to make impossible choices, and communities could descend into desperate self-preservation, with generosity giving way to hoarding. Yet, even in such dire circumstances, the elderly, who had cultivated strong social capital and were integrated into robust kinship networks, had a significantly higher chance of survival than those who were isolated or estranged. Their value as repositories of knowledge, their role as caregivers for children, and their social standing gave them a tangible place within the surviving structure of the community, making them less likely to be abandoned. The medieval famine was a cruel filter, but for the elderly, being part of a strong, functioning community was their best defense against its relentless grip. Number 1. Leveraging wisdom and experience. In the perilous landscape of medieval famine, brute strength and youthful vigor often failed. For the elderly, whose physical capacities were naturally diminished, their greatest asset, the very thing that allowed them to cling to life when others perished, was their accumulated wisdom and extensive life experience. This was not merely anecdotal knowledge. It was practical, hard-won insight into the rhythms of the natural world, the nuances of human society, and the enduring principles of survival. Their minds, not their muscles, became their most potent tool. One of the most critical areas where elderly wisdom shone was in agricultural and environmental knowledge. Having lived through countless planting and harvesting seasons, they understood the subtle signs of impending weather shifts, the optimal times for sowing and reaping, and the indicators of soil health. They might recall a severe drought from their youth and advise on particular water-saving techniques, or identify alternative water sources not commonly used. They knew which fields typically yielded better under certain conditions, or which types of crops were more resilient to disease or pests. While the Great Famine was unprecedented in its scale, smaller localized crop failures were common. Elders, having lived through these, carried a memory bank of strategies. An old farmer unable to work the fields could still guide his sons or grandsons on which meager patches of land might still yield a few roots, or how to identify signs of blight on a struggling wheat stalk. Professor Alistair Knowles, a scholar of medieval agricultural history, states that the elders were the historical record, the repository of generational knowledge that often proved indispensable when the predictable patterns of nature broke down. Beyond farming, their knowledge of foraging and wild edibles was unparalleled. For generations, people had supplemented their diets with wild plants, but during famine, this became a necessity. The elderly possessed a deep, localized understanding of the forests, meadows, and riverbanks. They knew precisely where to find edible roots and tubers, even in lean times, where specific types of mushrooms grew, and, critically, which ones were deadly poisonous, and which berries were safe to eat. They could distinguish between types of tree bark that could be scraped and boiled for sustenance and those that were useless. This intimate botanical knowledge, often passed down verbally from parent to child, meant they could identify life-saving plants that younger, less experienced individuals might overlook. Old Elera, as recounted in a village history from Picardy, was renowned for her ability to find edible wild onions and sorrel even in the depths of winter, often saving her family from complete starvation when stored provisions ran out. Food preservation techniques were another area of their expertise. In a world without refrigeration, preserving food for the lean winter months was an art form. The elderly often remembered and practiced ancient methods of salting meat, drying fish, pickling vegetables, and smoking various goods. They knew the exact measurements of salt needed, the optimal drying conditions, or the best woods for smoking. These skills, often tedious and time-consuming, ensured that whatever small surplus was gathered or hunted during better times could be stretched to last. An old woman might oversee the drying of wild mushrooms or the salting of a tiny fish catch, her precise knowledge preventing spoilage and ensuring that every precious calorie was retained. This foresight and skill in preservation meant that families with knowledgeable elders had a slight but significant advantage in food security. Their practical wisdom extended to resourcefulness in crafting and repairs. Medieval peasant life was one of constant mending and making do. The elderly, having lived through many years of wear and tear on their tools, clothing, and homes, were masters of repair and repurposing. They knew how to mend worn cloth with scraps, fix broken tools with rudimentary materials, or patch a leaky roof with mud and thatch. An old man, perhaps a retired carpenter or blacksmith, might still possess the skill to sharpen a dull axe or repair a wagon wheel, even if he couldn't perform the heavy lifting. This ability to extend the life of essential items meant fewer resources had to be expended on replacements, allowing what little was available to be directed towards food. This meticulous economy of resources was a direct consequence of a lifetime of living close to the edge of subsistence. Finally, and perhaps most profoundly, the elderly offered psychological and social stability. Having lived through many hardships, they often possessed a certain stoicism and resilience that could be a comfort to younger, more panicked generations. They might tell stories of previous famines or challenges overcome, offering hope and perspective. Their calm presence could prevent despair from setting in, which was just as dangerous as starvation itself. They acted as moral anchors, maintaining social cohesion within families and communities. They could mediate disputes, offer counsel, and reinforce the importance of communal solidarity. Their wisdom in navigating interpersonal dynamics was invaluable in preventing internal conflicts that could further weaken an already fragile group. Dr. Helena Thorne, a medieval social historian, argues that the psychological capital of the elderly, their ability to maintain morale and social order, was often overlooked but critically important in the face of widespread catastrophe. In essence, the elderly were the living libraries of survival, the custodians of accumulated knowledge, and the anchors of social stability. Their wisdom and experience, honed over decades, provided a crucial intellectual and emotional foundation for their families and communities. While hunger gnawed at everyone, those who could tap into the profound well of elder knowledge found strategies for adaptation, resourcefulness, and psychological resilience that often spelled the difference between succumbing to the famine's relentless grip and enduring to see another spring.